Trauma is a word that produces fear in a lot of people, and I think it also produces confusion. And so, my hope today is that I just have a conversation with you to help in some ways answer questions, but also demystify this term trauma. And I think there are a lot of misconceptions out there. And so, for the next couple minutes, let's have a conversation about what is trauma. I think the age old conversation is that trauma is linked to PTSD. And so you can only have trauma if you have PTSD, and you can only get PTSD if you've been in combat and in the military. And I think in a lot of ways that has minimized the experiences of others that have had similar somatic responses to external events. So let's just talk a little bit about what is trauma. Trauma, simply put, is the body's natural protective mechanism and response to an adverse outside event. So not all traumatic events produce trauma, and not all trauma is produced by traumatic events. The way in which we respond is uniquely represented in our DNA and in our own experiences, whether it be cultural, familial, our systematic responses to the environment, our genetic responses, all play into this conversation of how our body's going to respond when we're put in a situation that is fight, flight, or freeze producing. And I use that term because it's a term that's used broadly in society. So what is this idea of fight, flight, or freeze? And I want to spend a couple minutes breaking this down. Our fight, flight, and freeze response is our body's protective mechanism to the outside external stimuli. And in a lot of ways, it creates an opportunity for us to fight, to flee, or to freeze. And I want to break those down just for a minute. So when the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism is turned on, it is our sympathetic nervous system. And it's turned on and it creates several different symptoms. The first symptom is that our heart rate increases. It pumps blood to our major organs and our muscles so that we can get ready to fight or run. We also increase our breathing so that we can take in more oxygen to, again, fight or run. It constricts our pupils, so we are more focused, more laser focused. It lets less light in so that we can see things better. And it also creates a slowed digestive response so that we don't have to worry about eating or taking care of those basic physical needs. And this is done with the adrenal response and the cortisol response, two hormones that jumpstart this fight, flight, or freeze response. But what also happens in our brain is that we stay within what we call the cortical limbic cycle, which is the engagement of parts of our brain that take in the sensory information, that process it really quick to the amygdala, which is our emotional part of the brain, that where the fight, flight, or freeze response is actually held. And it creates this mechanism of action that almost happens unintentionally, maybe is the right word, unintentionally or spontaneously, without thinking about it. We just go into this mode of protection. So because this is an involuntary response, our brain can in some ways be a dumb organ in this moment, and it just reacts and responds, and it might not get it right all the time. It's doing what it can to protect us and our body, but it shuts off the reasoning functioning part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, because it's really highly engaged in protective mechanism and mode. And here's the thing. And this is where I have a lot of conversations with people in my life, my clients, family members, those in the community, where we get this idea of trauma wrong. Because shame, talking down to somebody, belittling somebody, could jumpstart the trauma response in an individual's body. They've not experienced sexual assault, they've not experienced combat or car accident or fill in the blank. They've experienced being talked to poorly with this sinister sarcasm or bullied, right? Those types of things can actually create a trauma response in somebody. Or the fear of. I remember a couple of years ago when my dad was in the hospital after a botched cancer surgery, I actually had a trauma response reaction prior to walking into the ICU because I knew everything was going to be different. The dad that I knew going into that surgery was not the dad that I was going to see on life support. And that kickstarted that fight, flight, or freeze response. And I had to make, because of my training, because of my EMDR experience, I knew what was happening, and I had to make a conscious choice to push through that and enter into that room and work through those feelings. But most of us don't have that luxury of really knowing what's going on until we're told or have a conversation like we're having today. Now, on the other side of things is what we call big T trauma. So small T trauma might be bullying, it might be shame, it might be fear of, it might be prolonged worry or stress that creates that stuff. That's small T trauma. Not any less important or any less damaging than big T trauma to our body and our somatic functioning. But big T trauma is that sexual assault, rape, it's a major car accident, it's watching somebody die, it's combat. Those also create that somatic response. And there's varying degrees to which this has happened. If you want to think of the trauma response on a spectrum, there can be a spectrum of not so severe but still traumatic to significantly severe and almost impairing to the place of not functioning. And so there is that spectrum. But again, it's not graded on your experience was any less or more important than the other person's experience. But what really happens is that our brain, in a lot of ways, breaks. It takes that sensory input and it fragments it into the sites of reception, meaning when I am, let's say, bullied and somebody puts their hands on me and throws me in a locker, my body records that sensory information, but it doesn't digest it properly into the thinking part of the brain of, well, maybe that guy had a bad day, maybe he's being bullied at home by his parents and he's taking out it on me because he wants to exercise power. That doesn't go through my head. What goes through my head is I'm unsafe, my body's defenses are up, and they get stuck at the site of reception. So when I go home and my mom wants to give me a hug, my body doesn't know the difference between that hug and the guys that are trying to stuff me in the locker, and my body might jump into that trauma response again. I know it's complicated, but the best example I could give. And so what happens is we operate in this fight, flight, or freeze response that is almost on a subversive level that might not be seen by the naked eye, for us even as well, until we get triggered. Somebody touches us, we smell something, I think about the car accident, the sulfur smell of an airbag. In the moment, you're grateful that you're alive, the airbag saved your life, but you smell that sulfur again someplace else, whether it be salt or something else, and it creates that immediate trauma reaction, the adrenaline and the cortisol. The reason I say this is that I want to encourage you as you listen to take stock on your story and on your life and go, have there been experiences in my life that maybe have produced a trauma response? And how has my body reacted and responded? And how have I cognitively and intentionally responded? What this tells me is how ready you are to engage in the processing out of the trauma, whether it be through narrative therapy, through EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, whether it be through just talk therapy. We have to have that cognitive understanding of where we're at before we can move forward. And once we're ready to move forward, then there are tools that we provide here at Mayfield Counseling Centers that many amazing counselors in this country can provide that help you process out your trauma in a way that actually engages the parasympathetic nervous system, which reverses everything we talked about. It slows down heart rate. It slows down breathing. It restores brain functioning and blood vessels in the brain so that you can engage your thinking part of the brain. It restores digestion. It turns off the adrenal gland and the cortisol gland so that you can bring your body back to homeostasis. It doesn't mean maybe that the trigger won't come back and those things will be jump-started, but it gives you a place of rest and restoration so that you can begin to function the way that you were meant to function. Why is this important? This is important because if we go and ignore big T or small t trauma, if we belittle it, or if we push it aside, or if we numb it out, the body still is going to operate in this heightened sense of awareness, and our adrenal glands will be turned on. You might get adrenal failure or fatigue. Your cortisol spigot, hormone spigot will be left on, and that deteriorates your immune system. So what happens is you go from purely a physiological, emotional, and mental response to a um, almost an immune response, where your immune system begins to deteriorate and let in sickness, which can lead to other diseases like cancer, like coronary heart disease, like cardiovascular disease, and your body will do what it can or will do what it needs to make sure that it's safe. So if you want more resources, one great resource is a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. You can look it up on Amazon. It's a bestseller. It walks you through what we've talked about at a deeper level. There'll also be a video attached to this one describing what is EMDR. We know what the problem is. We know it's trauma. And so how do we begin to work through that and on that? And that is this video called What is EMDR? And we'll talk through the process of eye movement desensitization reprocessing and how it helps bring the brain back into wholeness and bring the parasympathetic nervous system into activation so that the trauma response is turned off.